So I'm going to talk about 3 things from a teacher's perspective for failing to report to work and or missing 10 or more days. Okay? So get ready. First reason that teachers miss work. Professional development. Going to talk about that. Number 2, we're going to talk about pregnancy, giving birth, and having kids who sometimes get sick. And number 3, flipping COVID. A few years ago, I started writing a fictitious story based on my time as an educator. It is called Taught, and the story was partially inspired out of anger and frustration fueled by burnout. Okay, actually it was more than partially inspired by anger and frustration. But Taught has also become a vehicle for me to tell what I thought at the time, and in some ways continue to think, was and is the real story of teaching. I now realize that my perspective is not everyone's perspective, but there are some pieces of Taught that resonated with many educators. This podcast is an extension of that story, and I, a former teacher, will interview other educators asking them to share how they really feel about the current state of education. Why are so many teachers burn out? Why are so many, like me, leaving the field? We likely won't solve any problems or come up with any solutions, but we can create a community of voices that maybe begin the conversation around how educators can take back teaching. I'm Melissa LaFleur. Welcome to Taught, the podcast.
I like to be educated, but I'm so frustrated. Hello to my loneliness.
Hey everybody, here we are, episode 26. And every once in a while, I have a blank spot in my schedule. And it happens because of just how the months kind of coordinate. I have Amy's episodes that I need to have on at a certain time because we've set up the online group burnout sessions. And then I cannot do an interview with the teacher and have it be under a couple of hours. And then when I edit everything, it ends up being 2 episodes because I feel like, we need to keep it reasonably paced. Plus I have to pay for the actual hours of podcast that I put up. So I pay for a certain plan. So I try not to go over that amount. Having said all of that, I end up with these blank spots, and I kind of try to fill them with doing my own podcast on something that I think is relevant and important for teachers. So today's episode is number 26. And before we get started, I do want to say I'm going to be reading some notes, which typically I do a script. And today I got myself so fired up over the script. I was like, okay, I'm just going to make my script up and I'll read the parts that I want to read, and the ones that I want to go off on a tangent on, I probably will, because like I said, today's topic has got me pretty fired up. But before we start, I do want to say that since this is episode 26, it is important to acknowledge the fact that I am over the halfway point for my goal. So I'm dedicated to producing 50 episodes of the podcast, and your support has been amazing. If you'd like me to keep going, please show your appreciation by liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. Your encouragement will help me decide if I should continue this journey after my 50 episodes. Sometimes it's hard because I am a new podcast and I don't get a lot of feedback. and I am on several different social media sites. So if I could get that feedback, it would be really nice. I'm always open to adjusting my format or adjusting things to better please my audience, which is educators, specifically educators who are feeling burnout for a variety of reasons. So I need that feedback from you. It's not just about, the likes and the subscribes, but that does influence how much I think I'm having the effect that I want to have. Okay, so today's episode I decided to do on teacher absenteeism. So, we talk a lot about absenteeism in education, and typically when we're talking about it, we're talking about student absenteeism. I think that's also an important topic. But what I'm really frustrated about right now is all of these articles that keep popping up in my feed. And why do they pop up in my feed? Because I do a lot of research and I do a lot of reading about teachers, even though, and educators in general, education in general, specifically in the United States. And I do this because even though I'm no longer teaching in the US, I still have a connection to it. I still have a lot of friends and people that I care about that are within that system. And I want to make sure that I know what's going on with them. I also, hope to be an advocate in whatever ways they need an advocate in, which is, again, why I started the podcast so that we could have some real conversations around burnout. So there have been several articles that have come out it's actually been coming out in the last few years. I found articles that actually went back to 2004 about teacher absenteeism. But the ones that have been popping up in my feed lately, I wrote down two here, two that just came up in the past few months. They had titles that made me not want to read them. The first one was Absent Teachers Risk Costing American Schools $4 billion a year. That's right, teachers. When we're sick, we're costing the public $4 billion a year. The second one was Struggling Students Need Their Teachers to Show Up. That second one was an opinion article written by none other than Michael Bloomberg himself. And by the way, that first article that I read was also published by Bloomberg. So I find the titles alone to be inflammatory at best. So I wasn't super motivated to read them, but I did. And they were lacking some important information that only an educator might have been able to share with them had they been interested in looking at this from an educator's perspective. And I find this to be a theme in my podcast and in the work that I'm doing, is that we have a lot of people who have never actually worked in the education system telling us what we're doing wrong or how we need to change. And that in and of itself is super frustrating. So let's talk about definitions first, because I do want to talk about how teacher absenteeism is being defined. And what was really interesting is I think a lot of the world, I occasionally use AI to help me, especially when I'm doing research and I cannot find definitive answers. I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, but that's a little bit scary in terms of content that is being put out and research and ethics. Is that when I can't research and find answers to the why behind topics, it's very concerning to me. Okay, I'm not going to go there, but so teacher absenteeism, even AI, whenever I typed it in, I said, what metrics are being used to determine what constitutes teacher absenteeism? Even my AI, tool said, well, it depends. But some things that we know do crop up are they're looking at substitutes and attendance guidelines. and then the number of days that teachers miss. So that's kind of what they're going with. So here is one definition, and I will put all the links to, I read multiple articles to do this episode. So I'll put links to all those articles in there. This is from policytoolbox.iepunesco.org. And it says teacher absenteeism is defined as any failure of an employee to report for or to remain at work as scheduled, regardless of reason. And the second thing that I wanted to look at and define before we start talking about this and breaking it down today, according to my opinion, is what makes chronic teacher absenteeism, because you see this crop up a lot in the articles as well. Chronic teacher absenteeism is causing this, learning to decrease, blah, blah, blah. So chronic teacher absenteeism is being defined by, and this was journalistresource.org, specifically under the education tab. So chronic teacher absenteeism is defined as teachers missing 10 or more days of work, according to the U.S. Department of Education. So once again, in my opinion, we have some statistics that were quoted by both of those Bloomberg articles about the effect that teacher absenteeism is having on the American education system. But those statistics only told one side of the story and were specifically used to vilify educators. And like I said, I found articles dating back to 2004 that talked about why teachers were being absent. So what was interesting is those statistics seem to have the intent of railing against lazy educators that were, leaving their little dumplings in the classroom to the wicked substitutes who were not qualified to be going into the classroom. And so that was kind of the agenda at that point in time, was these teachers are leaving the classroom and we have these substitutes that aren't qualified to be stepping in. And this is why our kids aren't learning. I mean, this always comes back to, and this is the reason our kids aren't learning. Well, there are multiple reasons, folks, and it's not just teachers. Okay, I digress. So it was likely this rhetoric in the early aughts around these substitutes and how they were not qualified that created a lot of the policy change we saw after that. The movement became, how are we going to get qualified substitutes into the classroom to teach when teachers are absent for whatever reason they're absent. And so a lot of states and districts came up with a bunch of requirements for substitutes to have before they could be substitutes. And then that kind of transitioned into later on, much later on, if you're a substitute, I want to acknowledge that, to getting paid more, because substitutes didn't get paid that much. So honestly, the research for this episode took me down a lot of rabbit holes, and I could have done several episodes on several facets, one of them being substitute teachers in this little facet of the whole, this little puzzle piece of the whole puzzle. But we're going to stay on the topic of teacher absenteeism today. But I do want to say that those policy changes for substitutes likely began, they created some changes that set us up for a decline in substitutes. That was just going to a decline that progressively increased. So I'm going to make some connections today about substitutes and the pandemic and why teachers miss school. To me, they are common sense connections, but I also have a big group of articles that support most of what I am saying. And again, I will post those in the show notes. So let's go back to that definition for just a minute. Absenteeism is defined as a failure to report to work. And that is oftentimes marked by whether a substitute is required. Additionally, chronic absenteeism is missing 10 days or more. So bear with me. I'm going to talk about three things from a teacher's perspective or an educator's perspective. I'm going to use teacher because that's what most of the data is tracking, is teachers specifically. So I'm going to talk about three things from a teacher's perspective for failing to report to work and or missing 10 or more days. Okay. So get ready. First thing, first reason that teachers miss work, professional development. Going to talk about that. Number two, we're going to talk about pregnancy, giving birth, and having kids who sometimes get sick. And number three, flipping COVID. So, vamos lá. Let's get started. Change my page notes here. By the way, I also had eye surgery. So I have worn glasses since I was 10 years old. Now I don't need glasses for this eye. Do need them for this one. Need readers for this eye, maybe the other eye. I don't know. So you may be seeing me put my glasses on and off here. I'll make it work. Okay. So the first one I want to talk about is professional development. And in the span of my 20-ish years in education, I worked for 3 school districts and in 4 different grade levels. All 3 districts demanded that I keep a log of professional development points so that I was able to later renew my teaching credentials. And yes, if you know me, you know I want to rail about this stupid system in education, but I will stay on topic. So, if you're not an educator, I'm going to try to give you the quickest rundown I can of how this system works and how it relates to professional development. We also call it PD because we do love our acronyms. So, you need so many points to equal essentially a college credit. And this is about continuing education requirements for professionals. Teachers are not the only ones that have this continuing education. What's the word for it? Requirement. There we go. Teachers are not the only ones who have this continuing education requirement. Lots of professionals do. Ours requires that you either get college credits or you take workshops, classes, you go to professional development PD events that will give you a certain number of points. You then have to take these points and log them into a database that is connected with some state system, your state system, whatever state you're working in. Then, whenever it comes time for you to renew your teaching credentials, which just depends on your licensure and your state and what credentials you actually have, it's usually around 5 years, you have to go, and sometimes it's up to 10, but you have to renew and you have to cash in your professional development points, showing that you've been doing continuous learning, which is a requirement. So, districts oftentimes will actually keep us posted about professional development opportunities because for teachers, I mean, it's a little hard to take a college class and teach. So also we get tired of spending money on continually educating ourselves. So our districts typically understand this. HR is very invested in keeping the teachers with the appropriate credentials. So they will tell us these are the professional development opportunities that are available for your licensure, your grade level, what have you. And we're a little more invested in taking these opportunities because they typically help us in whatever area we are in to be better educators in that area. So we're kind of invested in it. We don't hate PD, especially when we get to choose it. So here's what happens though, is that the people presenting the PD typically are former educators themselves, and they like to work the same hours that we teach. So 1 or 2, maybe even 3 days a year, you'll have an opportunity and especially if it's time for you to keep up with your PD, you will have an opportunity to go and attend one of these. And that means you're going to be out of your classroom. And it shows up as a failure to report to work because you have to have a substitute. So sometimes we have to miss a day or two of school to attend these. And it does mean that we're going to show up on those missing day absenteeism issues. That data is being calculated into those metrics. And I don't know that it's in all of them, but certainly for some of the media outlets that are reporting this, I don't think that they're going through and, you know, pulling out professional development missed time. They're just looking at how many times we need a substitute. So, having said all of this, these moments are considered missed days or failures to report to work because they require a substitute. So, depending on which judgy media outlet is trying to make us look like we are avoiding the classroom, can be figured into the numbers surrounding the statistics touting teachers being outside the classroom. So, that's my number one that I think we just need to acknowledge. Number two, moving on. And now I'm really going to get going, folks, because this just drives me crazy. Pregnancy, giving birth, and having kids who sometimes get sick. That part doesn't drive me crazy. I will continue to say this on behalf of educators in the United States. And I have to be specific that it's in the United States because not every country has these ridiculous policies. We, educators, deserve to have our own families. We are not the servants of the American people just because we went to school to learn how to educate their children. Let me say that one more time in a different way. We are employees. The United States does not own us. I have had personal friends who know that I am a teacher, and they have complained to me when they find out that their child's teacher is pregnant, because they know that means that their child's teacher is going to miss some school that school year. How archaic, sexist, and entitled is this attitude? And it is prevalent. Okay. But the fact remains, according to our definition of teacher absenteeism, teachers will likely miss the 10 days that is going to throw them into the chronic absenteeism if they give birth. We've all heard tell of miracle teachers who give birth and they're back in a week or two. And I would just like to say it is probably not because they want that. It is probably because they are out of paid time off or PTO. And this is another issue in the education system that is just ridiculous. It's about like the professional development system of points that you have to jump through all of these hoops to renew your teaching license. Except this one's a little more insidious in my opinion. So, for anyone that might not know, again, if you're an educator, I know you know this, but for the rest of you out there, we teachers typically, no matter what district you're in, get a certain number of paid time off days. Actually, back when I very first started teaching, you got sick days, you got 2 personal days. Depending on the district, I went to one district, we got 4 personal days. It was like, wow, we got a bunch of personal days. And then you got, so you got so many sick days, you got so many personal days. Now it's usually in most districts, it's just paid time off. And you can bank this time. So that's really nice, right? You can bank this time off. And the idea is if you ever get chronically ill, or if you're a female and you decide to have a child or whatever, you have this time. It does specifically need typically to be around not being able to work, though. It's not like you can just take vacation, but you can use this time to do what you need to do. And all of that is well and good unless you can't bank it for some reason. And there's a lot of reasons that a teacher might not be able to. If you're in a district and you get 10 days a week, I'm sorry, 10 days a year, and you have something happen, you have the flu, and then everybody else in your family gets the flu. 10 days goes by pretty quickly. But when you get pregnant, you're expected to have enough days in there to cover your maternity leave. So let me repeat that. You can take your whole 12 weeks, which under FMLA, you are entitled to take. But if you want to get paid for them, your options are to have time banked so that you can continue to get your full salary, or to predict that you may need extra pay. Then you might not have the time off. So you pay to have short-term disability insurance so that then you can get paid during the time off after you have used up all of your sick days. So you have to use up all of your banked time before you can use your short-term disability usually. And another option is that you need to strategically plan illnesses and childbirth around your summer months off. So these are our options. And it speaks to what I said. The United States does not own its teachers, and we deserve to have our own families. And furthermore, we deserve to be able to get sick and care for those families ourselves. So, okay. So the other thing that should be noted here is once you have your little bundle of newborn bliss, or maybe your little blisses are somewhere between newborn and 18. Actually, we don't even have to put a number to it. You have children. You have children that are your children and you love and care about. They get sick, especially if they are school age, or if you're tossing them into the germ propagator known as daycare, where all the other little blisses are sharing bacteria and viruses. It happens. Your kids get sick. They need you to stay home and take care of them. So you have to take some days off here and there to actually care for your own children. And I know it's crazy. Educators needing to take care of their own families. How dare we? And then to miss a day, to fail to report to work. Well, it's wonderful that analysts are looking at all of those numbers so we can be held accountable for our laziness and the effect it is having on the American children we are educating. Thank you, Bloomberg. We truly are not worthy. We are not worthy of this treatment. We're worthy of way better treatment and acknowledgement. And so that brings me to my third point that I want to make about teacher absenteeism and why we should be looking at the whole picture. It's my favorite. COVID. Number 3, COVID. Where do I even start? Maybe we should start with an analysis that was done of absenteeism for teachers and the data. It was teacher absenteeism, and the data that they pulled and looked at was from the 2017-2018 school year. Ready for this? It said teacher absenteeism had improved over the last couple of decades. And when did COVID hit? Oh, that's right. It was called COVID-19. And the 19 was for 2019. So, all of this information that's coming out for these articles that are being put out by the media, where they're talking about how teacher absenteeism is having this huge negative impact on education, is being done 2019, 2020, 21, 22. Okay. So, maybe we should go with the fact that a lot of our data from 2020 to 2022 is pretty darn skewed. And I don't know how we can use any of it to be making these big blanket claims about teacher absenteeism having this negative impact. And I'm going to stop myself right there because it does have a negative impact. But again, we should not be blamed for it because there are a lot of different things going on here that affect all of this. And we shouldn't be making teachers feel like they can't be absent from the classroom when they need to be. Okay, so I'm going to go back now to my point, which is that data is skewed at best. I don't know if anybody remembers, but even within our upper systems in the US, like the CDC, we were all over the place with what we should or shouldn't be doing around COVID and how we were tracking things. So before I really get going here, let's have a moment of grace for the world being a hide the ears of the little ones, a clusterfuck. And that's pretty hard to track. A clusterfuck's hard to track. Okay. But here is what I do know. I personally did not get COVID until November 2022. I was thrice vaccinated and I was down hard for 2 weeks when I did finally get it. And then it took an additional 2 weeks for me to regain my strength and, get back to normal life. So, interestingly enough, NBC News reported on August 11th, 2022, this was the headline: CDC's new COVID guidelines for schools. Kids should stay in class if exposed. This was the 2022-23 school year. But let's come back to that. Let's cover what was happening in 2020 to 2022. We had national guidelines that mandated any or all of the following at a variety of times that changed depending on where you were at. So, just a reminder, because I think we forget what those 2 years were like. If you showed symptoms of COVID, you were to report it to your COVID officer in your school. Everybody remember those? Remember your COVID officers? A lot of times it was your office manager or it was an administrator. And that person was then responsible for tracking COVID data. You had to show negative COVID tests for a variety of situations. I remember that we had to all go and get tested negative and then signed vouchers just to come back. It would have been the 2021 school year. Because we were not in person. We were trying to figure out how to go back in person, but teachers all had to show up. And so we had to get negative COVID tests just to show up on the school campus. If you had been exposed to COVID, you were required to report it. And you had to quarantine for a certain amount of time. And it was on the honor system, but you still had to sign documents saying that you were telling the truth. A lot of times when you showed up for whatever at school, you had to sign documents stating you did not have symptoms and had not been exposed. I could go on at the stuff that we had to do for those 2 years. So, how does this lead to teacher absenteeism? Well, educators, it became our responsibility not to expose the children of America to COVID. We had to keep them safe. And I'm not against that. That was not a bad thing. So if you woke up one morning for school with a sore throat and a little fever, you were required to report this. Now, I don't want to speak for every teacher in the United States, but I do want to say I have had strep throat a number of times. Children, they don't mean to, but before COVID, we're not the greatest hand washers. We encouraged it, but we weren't keeping hand sanitizer where you hand sanitized when you came in the room and hand sanitized when you left. And I got strep throat a few times. Many times I woke up with a sore throat and a little bit of a fever. And you know what I did? I went to school anyway. And while I was at school, I called my doctor. I took ibuprofen that morning, gargled some salt water because I knew that was what my doctor was going to tell me to do. I messaged my doctor, called him, whatever, said, "Can you call me in a prescription?" Pretty sure I got strep throat again. He called it in, picked it up on my way home from work. I never missed a day of work because of it. However, all of a sudden, we were put into the situation where we were exposed to everything under the sun. And if you sneezed, if you coughed, if you had a sore throat, if you had a small fever, you were expected to report it. And we were really under a lot of pressure to keep all these kids safe. And we took it really seriously. And folks, we educators are typically rule followers. We don't love this about ourselves, but we're rule followers, right? And we're pretty honest. So we followed the guidelines. And guess what? Teacher absenteeism skyrocketed. How could it not? How could it not? Then, lucky us, in 2022, we decided it was okay for everybody to get COVID in the US and spread it around merrily. And we did. And the children of America turned out to be excellent super spreaders whose families were only too eager to send their fever cheeks and coughing little butts to school. No problems there. I mean, we would be like, pretty sure this one has COVID. But we also got into this realm of, well, I can't force anybody to be tested. I can't send them home. I mean, we were all over it. There's a lot we could say about this. But the reality is, all of those kids coming to school sick created a lot of COVID, and many educators like myself that were holdouts because we'd been wearing our masks, we'd been doing what we needed to do. We finally got COVID. So this goes back to what I was saying. In 2022, I got COVID and I was flat on my back for 2 weeks. Now, in the land of teacher absenteeism, that's 10 days. All of a sudden, I have chronic absenteeism. So let's see here. Well, let's go back to that. So not only did some teachers finally get COVID, but some of us, not me, but some of my colleagues got it many times over starting in the school year 2022, 2023. Yeah, because we were just exposed to it over and over and over. And we had to call in sick because we were sick. And guess who didn't want to get sick? Substitutes. And I don't blame them. And they have a choice. Substitutes have a choice. And if the agencies like Bloomberg and the other media outlets who are presenting information about teacher absenteeism and substitute shortages have an issue with this, then we need to look at the whole system, because it is okay for substitutes to say, I don't want to go work at this school because I hear they're having a COVID outbreak. I don't want to work in the school system right now because they're not making their teachers and students wear masks, and somebody in my home has cancer, and I don't want to bring that back to them. It's the American classroom changed a lot after COVID. And all of a sudden, we had these out of control classrooms. And it is okay for substitutes to say, I get to choose, and I don't want to work in a classroom where it's out of control. And additionally, there was that year, maybe even it could be argued almost 2 years, where substitutes weren't needed. And some of them depended on this for their income, and they had to figure other things out. So they did what they had to do. And let me take a pause here, make sure I'm on track. When the substitutes don't come in and they aren't wanting to work in the school system anymore, resources from all over school districts are pulled to cover classrooms. But let's stop blaming the educators. This isn't our problem to fix. I am so sick of media that is only telling this one side of the story, because it's not just our fault. We deserve to be sick. We deserve to do professional development, and we deserve to take care of our own families. And substitutes deserve to have the choice of whether or not they want to work within this system. So is it affecting student learning? Absolutely. Is it a societal problem? You bet your life it is. It is not a teacher problem. So I want to wrap this up with a personal experience. For many years of my career, I took one day off each year with one of my teacher besties, and we went shopping. Our partners were working. Our own children oftentimes were in daycare or school, and we could shop on a weekday where the shopping centers were less crowded. We usually went to areas that were a bit of a distance from our district, and I have no regrets or guilt because of this. I gave days when I should have stayed home. I took one day each year. But if you want to calculate the difference between what I took and what I gave, there's no competition here. I gave the public education system so many days when I should have been staying home and taking care of mine, whether it was my health, whether it was my family, or it was my professional development. So the education system is lucky to have each and every educator that it has. And people, take a day for yourselves. And you know what? If anybody asks you, you can say what I always said. I have an appointment. And I never said what kind. My appointment was with my teacher bestie to do a little shopping and enjoy my life a little bit. So that's all I have to say about teacher absenteeism. I would love to know your thoughts. Hopefully I didn't stray off my topic and get too distracted too many times. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this and anything else teacher burnout related. Thanks for listening.
I wish I knew.
Today's episode was produced and edited by me. The theme music is by Otis McDonald featuring Joni Inez.
But I'm so frustrated.
If you know someone who might enjoy these conversations, please share the podcast episodes as much and as often as you can. It's as simple as copying the link you use to access today's episode and sending it in a message or sharing it on social media. I'm a small independent operation, and your shares broaden our audience. Perhaps you or someone you know will be inspired to talk about teacher burnout. If you would like to get your voice on my podcast, contact me via the link on my webpage, tot.buzzsprout.com. Coach, speaker, and author Rashid Ogunlaru said, "It may take many voices for people to hear the same message." Join me in being one of the many voices rising up to get the message out around educator burnout. This is Melissa LaFleur. Thank you for listening to Tot, the podcast.
I wish I knew.
I have an important reminder/disclaimer to share. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. Content provided on this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be taken as professional advice. We encourage you to do your own research and consult with qualified professionals before making any decisions based on the information discussed in this or any other episode. Additionally, any opinions or statements made during the podcast are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, or individual. Listener discretion is advised. Thank you for tuning in,